In this history lesson, we're going to start looking at metals, the different materials we used across prehistory. We talked about the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and they've all got names of materials, and those materials are important. So I think it's very important we have a little look at the history of different materials just for this lesson. So our learning objective to learn how different materials were used across prehistory. So going back to the timeline we've used before, we're going to be focusing on the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, not so much the Stone Age. So I'm not going to talk about where people found stones and things like that. You do need to realise that important things did happen. In fact, we're going to go a bit into the Neolithic because we're going to be talking about things like copper. But there are important things that happen before any of this could start. It's a bit like a computer game where you have to unlock technologies before you can get to new technologies, and it's not like Minecraft where you have to combine things to make other things. If you don't have the first things, you can't have the later things. So to do any of this, a few things had to happen. First of all, people had to not spend all their time worrying about food, which means you had to have farmers that could produce more food than they themselves ate, so that somebody else could eat the spare food and have enough time to work out how to do things with metals. You needed to have stone tools to even start because you can't cut a tree down without a stone axe. So stone tools have to come first and wood has to come first. And people will keep on using stone and wood all throughout this time period. We still use them today. Animal bones and horns are also a useful early material. So those things from the Stone Age, wood, stone, farming, all of those things are very, very important. Farming gives us houses, and houses mean we can stay in one place, as we saw on our earlier ones. And if you're moving around all the time, you can't do all this sort of thing. So it's very important. So let's see what people discovered. Okay. On these pictures that we looked at before, there will be lots and lots of things made of metal. I might come back to this picture later. So what metals did people find? Well, the first thing they found was native copper. And when I say people, I mean people in the entire planet, not necessarily people in Britain. So these dates don't necessarily match when people in Britain found these things. This is when some early people found them, and there might be some a little bit earlier, like the Egyptians got gold, I think, a little bit before Britain, but I think this is like the main starting points. So the first thing we're going to talk about is native copper. Now, native means you can find it already as the metal. That means you could go out for a walk and dig up a hole in the ground and pull out a bit of that metal, and it's already that metal. Okay, this is very useful because it means you haven't got to do much to it to then use it. But not many metals you can find in that native form. That means already a metal naturally. Most of them you need to do something to it. And I will say, most of that native metal's already been found. So you won't be able to go out now and do what somebody in the Stone Age or the Bronze Age did when they just walked out and found copper on the floor, because most of it's been found. So native copper is here. Smelted copper, that means when you start taking copper that isn't just a lump of copper, it's in an ore. And an ore is when the metal is mixed in a rock with other materials, other rocks and things that you don't want. And you need to get that metal out of that rock. And that's a lot harder. And you can see that if that didn't happen until 5000 AD, notice how this is AD. So now is in this direction. Now's over here, a long way that way. In fact, it's about there. You can see how we're going a long way back in time. There's 2000 years between here and here. And then there's an extra 1000 to here, 1000 to here, 1000 to here. So we're talking a long, long time ago. So native copper, then nothing for a few thousand years until people start to smelt copper. People are smelting lead by here, gold by here, and silver. And then people are using bronze, which is made of copper and tin. So you need the copper that we talked about back here, but you also need tin, and they're doing that by here. So this is native copper. This is smelted copper. This is lead. This is gold and silver. This here is bronze, which is made of copper and tin. And then right at the end here, we get iron. So we're going to look through some of these materials, see where people found them, what they were used for, have a little bit of a talk about them so that you've got a bit more background knowledge. And then for your piece of work today, you're going to look around your house and see what of these materials are actually still used, because a lot of them still are. And that's the important thing. Just because the Bronze Age came along didn't mean people stopped using stone and wood. And then when the Iron Age came along, people didn't stop using bronze. And copper, because it doesn't have an age named after it, doesn't mean that it didn't exist. Lead and gold and silver, they still existed. But these are the metals that ancient humans had, or prehistoric humans had. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different metals. That's very different today. At this moment in time, I've got a phone in my pocket. The fact I have a phone in my pocket means that I have got at least 30 different metals on my body. Between the bits of my phone, my zip, my belt buckle, all of those sorts of things, there are a huge number of metals, and a lot of them we've only been using for about 20 years. These metals are the old ones. So, why did people not know about the other ones? Why did it take them time to work through them? Well, let's have a look at them. The first one is native copper. Now, as I said before, native copper is just something you can find. There's a picture of a bit of native copper there. What's very important is that you understand that most of these metals need heat to work. So in your science with Mr. Jarman, you've been talking about heating things to make them melt. Now, metals need to be heated quite high to make them melt. And depending on what sort of fire you can make, it depends on what things you can melt. Now, native copper doesn't need to be melted because you can find it as a lump. It does need to be heated up. And when metals get heated up, but they don't melt, they do go to a point where they start going soft. So they're red and glowy and they're a bit softer, but they're not yet melted. So with native copper, the very early people, still in the Stone Age, could find a piece of this funny looking rock, heat it up in their campfire, and then bash it with a rock to make it go into the shape they wanted, because they can kind of get it to a plasticine type consistency. Bash it into the shape of an axe or something, let it cool down, and then they've got an axe head. Now, this is not an axe head like modern axe heads. I've watched somebody trying to cut a tree down, and it was a very thin tree with a native copper axe. It doesn't stay sharp for very long. It's very, very hard. You can only really do very small trees, and then cutting those trees up into planks is impossible. But it's a start. Without this, you can't move on. So fire is a very important invention. If you haven't unlocked fire, shall we say, as one of your technologies, you can't do anything with the copper even if you find it. And you need to have stone, because you need to have stone tools to hammer the native copper into shape. So here's our first metal, first thing people are doing, finding a lump of native copper, sticking it in their campfire until it gets very, very hot and a little bit softer, bashing it into shape with a stone, and then using it as a slightly rubbish axe, but better than nothing. Then people found lead. Now, the thing about lead is it doesn't need to get very hot to be melted. The melting temperature of lead is quite low. In fact, the fire that we were talking about before could probably melt lead. So the moment people found lead ore, they could do a process called smelting. Now, smelting is where you crush up the rock that you find that you know's got lead in it. You mix it with other stuff like charcoal, and then you heat it up and the things separate. Now, because lead melts at quite a low temperature, people were able to do that with just a normal fire, like a campfire. So it's one of the earliest other metals that people found. The problem is, because it melts at such a low temperature and because it's normally very soft, it's also a bit rubbish. You can't make an axe out of lead because when you hit a tree with it, the axe would bend, not the tree. You can't make a sword out of it. It's rubbish. It's no use for doing things that need something very, very hard. It's not a hard metal. You can make pipes out of it and you can make cups out of it. And that's what people did to begin with. The downside of lead is it's incredibly poisonous and kills you. They didn't realise this at the time. Unlike later metals like iron and things like that, which we've actually got in our body and aren't bad for us. I mean, the iron in our cereal, you can look on the back of the packet if you want to see it. Lead is very, very, very bad for you. In fact, in this picture, the man that's melting lead is doing it in an old barbecue so that he can cover it up and then throw the barbecue away because lead is nasty, nasty stuff. I don't mean lead in a pencil, that's actually graphite. This is a different material that's got the same name. So, an early metal, but not a lot of use. But at least it shows people are starting to do that thing called smelting, where they melt the rock of something crushed up with charcoal and other things and start to pull metals out of rocks. It's a good start for something that only needs quite a weak fire. Then we've got silver and gold. A few hundred years later, people start to discover silver and gold. Now, gold, up here, you can find as a native metal. That means you can find actual lumps of gold laying around and pick them up. Now, gold, like lead, can be melted at very low temperatures. It's also incredibly soft, which means that for making tools out of, it's pretty useless. A gold sword or a gold hammer or a gold axe would be worse than useless. More importantly, it's incredibly, incredibly rare. Even today, sort of, what's that, 4,500 years later, if you took all of the gold that has ever been mined in the entire world, you'd only be able to make a cube 28 meters by 28 meters by 28 meters. It would basically fill 3 and a bit big swimming pools. There's not a lot of gold out there, which means not a lot of people could find this stuff. It existed, but it's not the sort of thing that you just trip over on your walk in the morning. What people did like about it is it's shiny. And shiny things that people want to make jewellery out of, but that are very, very rare, become very, very, very expensive. So whereas gold was found by people, and the Egyptians found it first, and they were mining it, they were digging holes and finding it underground, it was a very rare thing, and it's only really used for jewellery and impressive things and shiny things. The other option is silver. Silver often comes out of the same rock that you got the lead out of. So if you've worked out how to melt the lead out of something, you can sometimes get the silver out of it. But again, silver is a bit like gold. It's lovely and shiny, but very, very soft and pretty useless for hitting stuff with. You couldn't use a silver sword. You couldn't have a silver hammer. You couldn't have a silver axe. I know some games do have them, but it just wouldn't work. They're just too soft. You could bend them. People have to be very careful when they've got silver rings on, because if they hit it with a hammer, they would literally bend their ring. So that was the next metal. So a lovely metal for a very small number of people to make shiny things, but not very good for people in general. And then we get to the first really important one, bronze. So this is when the Stone Age stops being the Stone Age, it becomes the Bronze Age. Doesn't mean people stop using stone. It means that bronze becomes the most important thing. Now, bronze is a mixture of copper and tin. You have to mix two metals together, which means you have to be able to find the ores for those two metals. You can use native copper or you can find copper ore, and you need to find tin, and you need to find both of them and melt both of them and mix them together. The problem is they've got a much higher melting point than the lead and the native copper, which we weren't melting, we were just like softening, which means just putting it into a fire won't help. If you put bronze on a fire, a lump of it, it would just stay as a lump. And if you put bronze ore on a fire, you wouldn't melt out the good bits of metal from the rest of it. It would just stay there, getting hot. You need to make your hot fires hotter. Now, a fire is best looked at as a triangle. To get fire, you need three things. you need fuel. So in earliest cases, the fuel that they'd been talking about would probably have been wood. And wood burns quite hot, but it doesn't burn hot enough. You need oxygen. Now, oxygen is in the air, but you need to get it into your fire. And then the third thing you need is heat to start it off. Now, people could make heat. They could do sparks from stones, and I think a lot of you would have done that in forest school with Miss Irving, where you would have gone and made sparks and started off a fire. And you've seen our school, the fire in the forest school, but that wouldn't be hot enough to melt these metals. You need a better fuel and you need more oxygen. Now, the better fuel they worked out is charcoal, which is what we use in barbecues these days. To make charcoal, you basically have to start a fire, but you have to make it underground and cover it up with more soil, with more grass, so that it doesn't burn totally. The wood burns a little bit, and then that becomes charcoal. So with charcoal, which is another technology they had to find and unlock, you've got better fuel. And then you've got to get oxygen into it. Well, the earliest way people found to get oxygen into it was literally to use a tube and blow into the fire. Now, this takes a lot of energy. If you think this can take an hour or a couple of hours to melt this metal, you can't sit there blowing for a couple of hours. So you need lots of people, perhaps doing shifts and taking turns to do this. You can see why you can't do this if everybody's too busy farming or everybody's too busy hunting for food. This only works if some people don't have to worry about food because the farmers are doing really well on their own and they can sit there all day blowing into a pipe. Now, as time went on, humans realized that you could do it another way. So in this picture here, they're building like an oven. They're building this sort of smelting place. It's a very tall tube that they've made out of cob, which is a mixture of clay and grass, basically, which is stronger than just clay. And they've got a hole in the side of it, and that just allows wind to blow into it, and that allows temperatures to get very, very hot. If you get very hot, you can cast bronze. And this picture here is somebody pouring melted bronze into a mould, which is basically where they just made the shape of an axe in some clay and then waited for that to dry and then poured the bronze into it. The bronze is very, very hot, so it's a liquid. They pour it into that, it cools down very quickly, turns back from a liquid into a solid, but the solid is now in the shape of an axe head, which they could then sharpen. Bronze is better than copper. It's sharp, you can make it sharper than copper and it will keep its edge. So if you can do really, really hot temperatures, and someone's told you how to get bronze and tin out of the bits out of their ores and make bronze, then this is a better material, and this is why the Bronze Age started. Anybody with bronze will do better than people that don't have bronze. There's one other side effect of bronze. Like I said, you need tin and you need copper. This is a map of Europe. Anywhere where there is a green dot, there's copper ore. Anywhere where there's a blue dot, there's tin ore. But what you'll notice is that the tin is here, a little bit here, and they're not marked on the map, but there's a lot of tin in Cornwall in England. There's not a lot of places you can get tin from. And the places that have got copper aren't necessarily near the places you can get tin from, which means you had to have something called trade. It means some people had to travel very, very long distances with one of the materials to swap it with somebody who's got the other material so that you end up with both. So trading and swapping things and buying and selling things and traveling long distances has to be done before copper can be started. Bronze can be started. So you can see on this map here, the darker the colouring of the map, that means the sooner people worked out how to do bronze. And you can see that up in our little island up here, we're quite a light colour. So we were one of the last people to get that technology. So that gets us into the Bronze Age. People can now make good axes and swords and things like that. But copper, as we can see from this, bronze, as we can see from this, you're not going to have a lot of it. You know, you've got to trade it with somebody from a very, very long way away, and it takes an awful lot of work to do it. your little village, like those villages we saw at the beginning, we go back to, whoops, we go back to this Bronze Age village here, there's not going to be a lot of copper in that. It's possible that the chief might have a sword made out of copper. It's possible that oh, you might have the odd other thing there, maybe a copper axe that's owned by the village for cutting down trees to make the fences and the houses, but you're not going to have lots of it. Not many people are going to have it. It's too hard to make. It's too hard to find. There they're making copper just here. So there's not going to be a lot of it. Someone's still making flint tools because you still need to use stone. The next important stage, and the thing that gets us into this last stage where we find the Celts, is iron. Now, be very careful here to think that iron is better than copper. To begin with, iron wasn't better than copper. When done badly, iron is actually quite soft. You need to mix it with other things before it gets good. But the important thing is there's lots more of it. Now, to begin with, people from a very, very long time ago found meteors, bits of rock from space that had just native, well, it wasn't native because it came from space, but that had iron that was already iron that they could melt and hit with hammers and create things out of. But that was incredibly rare. What are the odds of finding a meteor in the ground? It's tiny. But if you dig, you can find iron almost everywhere. And this is the important thing. What happened is once upon a time, millions and millions of years ago, all of the seas had iron dissolved into the water. And then suddenly the world changed. There was more oxygen in the air. And suddenly all of that iron basically rusted and it all sunk to the bottom of the seas where it stayed and where it became iron ore. And that happened all over the planet. Don't forget the seas aren't necessarily now where they were back then. That means by the time you get to the Iron Age, and even now, there's iron in lots and lots of places. And to make iron, you just need iron. You don't need tin. You don't need to go and find a second metal. You haven't got to trade over long distances. You can find quite a lot of it. Now, working it is harder, but once you work out how to do it, you can make lots. So suddenly, unlike copper, which is something that only the elite, the richest and most important people can have, with iron, everybody can have some iron. You're a farmer? Brilliant. Have an iron plough to dig your holes for you. Make that far easier. You're the hunter? Brilliant. Have some iron arrowheads. Have an iron sword if you have to go and fight somebody. Have an iron helmet if you want to defend yourself. You're the blacksmith? Well, brilliant. Have some iron hammers. You're the cook? Brilliant. Have an iron knife. That makes it easier to chop up the food that you're making. Iron, because everybody can have it, suddenly becomes useful. You've got to smelt it, just like you have with copper, and you've got to get it even hotter than you had to get the copper, which meant that people really needed to get more air into it. Remember that triangle we drew, where we said that to get fire, you needed to have fuel, you needed to have oxygen, and you needed to have heat. Well, it's the same heat and it's the same fuel because they're still using charcoal. We'd used that for a long time, but they're having to really get air into it. Just relying on a bit of wind through a hole or somebody blowing through a pipe is not good enough. So what they made is, you can see here, these are called bellows. Now they're not quite what bellows look like now, but to begin with, they're basically a pot with a tube coming out the side. So here's the pot. There's a tube coming out the side, and on top there's a bit of material with a handle. Let's draw it over here, like that. And a bit of material on top. If you push the material down, it pushes air down the tube. When you pull it back up again, it sucks more air in, and then when you push again, it pushes more air into that fire. So these two people pumping these bellows can get this fire that's in here, that's underneath this, far, far, far hotter than they ever could do with other things, which is brilliant. It now means you can melt iron. It means everybody can have something, and we're finally into the Iron Age. And people can start doing other things like making swords and going and killing each other. So there were some downsides to the Iron Age, because if everybody can have metal, everybody can have a weapon, But there are a lot of upsides to it. Everybody can also have tools, and tools are very, very useful. Now, what are you going to do for your work? I thought about this. If I was in school, we might try and do some things with metals, but I don't know what metals that you've got at home, and I don't want you going and melting things at home because that would be incredibly dangerous and probably not possible with the things that you've got. Um, there's not a huge amount that you can do with this information other than just go and write everything I said down, which I don't think was fun. So I thought about it and I thought, well, what's important is that these materials were still used. Even in the Iron Age, people are still using bronze, just if you're rich and you want some of it, because to begin with, it was still better. People are still using gold and silver all through this time period because it's shiny. People are still using stone tools all the way through this time period because stone is hard and it is useful. People are still using wood all throughout this time period because wood is in some ways better than metal. Depends what you're making. Wood does not make a very good head for an axe, but it makes a very good handle for an axe. And a wooden table is a lot better than a metal table to begin with, especially when metal is very expensive. So these materials are used all the way through. In fact, we still use them. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to look around your house and you're going to look for any examples of things made of wood. And you're going to write me down a few things you can find in your house that are still made of wood. Be careful, it is wood and not something that's been decorated to look like wood. Look for stone. Harder to find, but you might find stone in your kitchen. You might have a stone worktop. You might have a stone chopping board. You might have stone in your garden because you might have stone patio, what are they called? Tile type things. So there might be stone. Copper. Copper and bronze, you can kind of look for those together. You might have copper and bronze because it is still shiny and pretty and people do still like buying it. There's another version of that's made of copper like bronze, and that's brass. And you might have brass things around your house, especially if you know anybody that's into horses. A lot of the things that dangle on horses' manes are made out of brass. You might have brass or bronze or copper teapots or things. They just look quite pretty. Silver and gold. I doubt you'll have any silver and gold, but your parents might have some silver and gold. Mr. Sims' wedding ring, for example, is gold. Mine's not. Mine's made of something else, but it's unlikely to be much, but there might be some tiny bits. Lead. I doubt you'll have much lead in your house. What you'll probably have is some lead where your roof meets the wall. Because it's quite soft, people that are making roofs use lead and they hammer it. So there could be some leading around your roof, but I doubt there'll be much in your house because frankly it's really poisonous and you don't really want to go near it. Iron, or its later version steel, which is iron mixed with some carbon or some zinc. That you probably will have in your house. You might have things like cast iron hob rings on your cooker. Your parents might have some cast iron tools or some steel tools that they use that are in their toolbox. Do not go and get those things. Ask them to show them to you if they don't mind. So you may or may not be able to find examples of those things in your house. Your job is to see what you can find. Take pictures of them or just write me a list, if it's easier, of what you found and where you found it. You might need to do a little bit of internet searching to check the thing that you found, what it's actually made of, because you might not know, you might not realise. There's also gold, by the way, in all our mobile phones, so that's a good place to look. Okay, if you've got any questions, let me know.